right. Thanking God again, this time for the chance to just get done in a week that has not been, as I mentioned, what I hoped it would be. Let's call Ezekiel chapter 9, No Pity, because I'm not feeling all that creative. And that is a quote that literally comes out of, I think, verse 5 in this chapter, where God is fed up and Israel, as we mentioned, or at least Judah, is about to find out what that is actually going to look like, as we mentioned in the last chapter, chapter 8. Chapter 9 is going to give us a great picture of what that means. Verses 1 through 2, or 1 and 2, basically saying God is going to bring out 6 men to handle business in the temple, or really in the city, with a 7th man. And he is going to mark a certain number of people for salvation. And in verses 3 through roughly 8, we're going to find out who those folks are. Verse 4 saying, "And the Lord said to him," that is the man in linen who was going to mark those saved. He says, "Pass through the city and through Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it." Going on to say that God will have no pity. Thus our title on the rest. I think I said that's in verse 5. Given the order in verses 6 and following as to who gets killed. And that's everybody. He names out where all he had to do was just say generally it's everybody else. He itemizes all of those in society who he would typically, or we ordinarily have sympathy on, and says God has reached a point where he is through. There's no pity even on those who otherwise seem helpless and sympathetic. Verses 9 through the end of the chapter, showing us a little bit of Ezekiel's response, where it actually starts in verse 8, where it is going to say he fell on his face and cried, "Ah, Lord, will you destroy all the remnant of Israel in the outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?" And even though the answer is no, it's not much of a no, because he is going to seem to allow for the destruction of just about everybody except for a small remnant. Verses 9 and 10 going on to say that the guilt of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of blood and the city is full of injustice. Therefore, in verse 10, he says, "As for me, my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will bring their deeds upon their heads." And the man in verse 11, dressed in linen, is going to report back that he, at least as far as the salvation of the remnant, has done what God had asked him to do. Reminding me that this is not the first, nor is it the last time we will seem to see God's heart grow cold, not only towards people, but even his own people. Understanding that as far back as Exodus 17, we had a series, not really a series, but a lesson that we entitled Beach House, where we saw the way that the people had gotten into the habit of getting their way eroded their relationship with God, much like you see the foundation for beachfront property eroded by waves over time. The waves in Exodus 17 was the complaining of the people as they complained over and over again to get their way instead of asking respectfully for God to meet their needs. Likewise, by the time you get to chapter 14, even though they might have lost count, as we said, about how much their complaining was eroding God's care for them, he had kept count and said these 10 times, even though they were going at Moses, God interpreted it as them complaining and going at him in order to get their way, because they found that even if God was upset by it, the complaining still got them what they wanted. And so likewise, going forward, as we mentioned from time to time, as Christ himself is giving us warnings about the end times, he says in the famous warning in Matthew 24, verse 12, "And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold." The love of the people around you, you might not have to worry as much about as you have to worry about the way in which the way you treat them eventually erodes God's tolerance for the things you've been doing. And as much as I say you, I never want to lose track of the we in that, because the danger, as we have sometimes seen, is being so preoccupied by the lawless things that you see around you that you forget the fact that the enemy has his eyes on me and we too. And for that reason, it's so important not to lose track of the application for these lessons in all our lives. As one of the sad parts of the opening of Lamentations reminded me of over and over the way in which Judah, in much the same way God is describing here in Ezekiel 9, the way they find themselves in the days when God brings the sword against them, how they find no comforters in their day of trouble. So even though we said it may not matter how much you treat people as much as the way you treat God, there are times when the people that you once rejected are the ones you would crave to have comfort you when you realize that God has actually grown tired of what you've been doing. As we see in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 2, among other places, talking about Judah, she had no one to comfort her. Going on in verse 9, as we once mentioned, she took no thought for her future. Therefore, her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. Going on even further towards the end of the chapter, verse 16 says, for these things I weep, my eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me. Verse 17, the next verse saying much the same thing. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. And toward the end of the chapter in verse 21, they heard my groaning, yet there is no one to comfort me. Reminding me of why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. May we learn to stop before God and everybody else he's left around us has flat out run out of pity.